What happens when filmmakers ignore the rules, defy authorities, and create something so provocative that society tries to silence them? Throughout history, certain films have pushed boundaries so far that they were banned, censored, or sparked outrage that followed them for decades. These aren't just movies, they're cultural lightning rods that changed how we think about what can be shown on screen. From technical innovations hidden behind disturbing messages to low-budget shockers that revolutionized entire genres, these controversial films reveal the power of cinema to both disturb and enlighten. Some of these movies were silenced for decades only to be rediscovered as misunderstood masterpieces, while others remain deeply troubling to this day. This is the untold story of how cinema's greatest rebels changed filmmaking forever, often at enormous personal and professional cost. The Silent Era Rebels. The story of banned and controversial cinema begins in the earliest days of the art form, when filmmakers were just discovering what was possible with this new medium. In 1915, D.W. Griffith unleashed The Birth of a Nation, a film that revolutionized cinematic language with its sweeping battle scenes, dramatic close-ups, and complex narrative structure. But this technical brilliance came with a devastating cost. The film's glorification of the KKK and deeply racist portrayal of Black Americans poisoned its legacy and sparked nationwide protests. The NAACP launched campaigns against the film, and riots erupted in several cities where it screened. Even President Woodrow Wilson, who initially praised the film after a White House screening, later distanced himself from it as public backlash grew. The film's influence extended far beyond cinema. Historians have linked it to the revival of the Ku Klux Klan in the 1920s, showing how a single movie could reshape American society in dangerous ways. Even as directors studied Griffith's groundbreaking techniques, the film became a warning about how powerful cinema could be in spreading hateful ideologies. Today, film students study it as both a technical milestone and a disturbing reminder of America's racist past, a paradox that continues to haunt film history. As Hollywood established itself as the global center of filmmaking in the 1920s, the film industry tried to project a wholesome image. But by the early 1930s, a wave of gangster films began challenging this facade, revealing America's fascination with outlaws and violence. The pre-code era, before strict censorship guidelines were enforced, allowed filmmakers brief freedom to tackle controversial subjects. When Scarface exploded onto screens in 1932, audiences were stunned by its unflinching portrayal of criminal life. Loosely based on Al Capone, who reportedly loved the film, it featured machine gun murders, hints of incest, and a protagonist who reveled in his violent ascent. The film's raw depictions of urban violence and its morally ambiguous anti-hero challenged the clean-cut image that studio executives wanted to project. Howard Hawks directed the film with remarkable visual flair, using shadows and innovative camera techniques to suggest violence even when it wasn't explicitly shown. The backlash was immediate, with critics claiming it glamorized crime and corrupted youth. The film was delayed for over a year as producers fought with censors, ultimately adding a new ending and text condemning gangster culture. This controversy ultimately contributed to stricter enforcement of the production code as Hollywood scrambled to control its public image. Yet today, Scarface is recognized as a groundbreaking work that dared to show America's dark underbelly and inspired generations of crime films, including the 1983 remake that became a cultural phenomenon of its own. That same year brought one of cinema's most unusual and misunderstood works. Director Todd Browning, fresh from success with Dracula, cast real carnival performers with physical differences in his haunting film, Freaks. The movie's empathetic yet unsettling portrayal of sideshow performers turned Hollywood conventions upside down. Instead of actors playing freaks, these were real people telling a story about exploitation and acceptance. The film's famous wedding banquet scene, where the performers chant one of us," remains one of cinema's most unforgettable moments, both welcoming and threatening. Audiences weren't ready. Viewers reportedly fled theaters, and one woman even claimed the film caused her to miscarry. MGM panicked, cutting the film from 90 minutes to just over an hour, removing most of its most disturbing scenes, including a castration and a horrific revenge sequence. The studio buried the film, and Browning's promising career was essentially over. Freaks was banned in the UK for 30 years, and the original uncut version has been lost forever. Yet time has been kind to what remains of Freaks, which has been rediscovered as a landmark film that questioned society's definitions of normality decades before mainstream culture was ready to have that conversation. Its influence can be seen in everything from David Lynch films to American Horror Story, political provocateurs. As World War II loomed, one beloved filmmaker decided to leverage his global fame to combat rising fascism. Charlie Chaplin's The Great. Dictator arrived in 1940 as a daring satire that directly mocked Hitler and Mussolini when many Americans still wanted to stay neutral in the European conflict. The parallels were unmistakable. Chaplin's fictional dictator Adnoid Hinkle ruled the nation of Tomania and persecuted Jewish citizens while dreaming of world domination. Chaplin's dual role as both a humble Jewish barber and a power-hungry Dictator demonstrated comedy's power to undermine authoritarian figures. The film's most famous scene shows Hinkle dancing with an inflatable globe, reducing the dictator's megalomaniacal ambitions to childish play. The film culminates in a passionate speech advocating for peace and human dignity, a striking departure from Chaplin's previously silent persona. Though tame by today's standards, Chaplin's willingness to take a political stand was revolutionary, especially since the United States wasn't yet at war with Germany when the film was released. Hitler, reportedly a Chaplin fan, was said to have watched the film twice in private. The movie was banned throughout occupied Europe, and Chaplin found himself on dangerous political ground. His advocacy against fascism later contributed to his exile from the United States during the McCarthy era, showing how even Hollywood's biggest star could be punished for controversial views. Despite these challenges, The Great Dictator became Chaplin's most commercially successful film and remains a blueprint for how comedy can confront tyranny. Not all controversial films were banned for tackling serious issues. Sometimes just challenging Hollywood's artificial moral code was enough. In 1941, Citizen Kane dared to present a thinly veiled critique of newspaper tycoon William Randolph Hearst, who used his considerable media power to suppress the film. Hearst papers refused to advertise it, and many theaters were pressured not to screen it. While now considered one of the greatest films ever made, Orson Welles' masterpiece was initially a commercial failure, partly due to this corporate censorship. The post-war era brought new challenges to censorship as filmmakers began to tackle previously forbidden subjects. Disney's Song of the South became one of the studio's most problematic releases in 1946. While featuring technological innovations in combining animation with live action, the film's romanticized portrayal of plantation life and racial stereotyping created a legacy so troubling that Disney has kept it locked away for decades. The film's depiction of Uncle Remus, a formerly enslaved man who tells cheerful stories to white children on a plantation during the Reconstruction era, has been criticized for creating a nostalgic view of a brutal chapter in American history. Civil rights organizations condemned the film upon its release, and each subsequent re-release has sparked fresh controversy. Despite creating the memorable Zip-a-Dee-Doo-Dah, which won an Academy Award for Best Original Song, the film's sanitized version of the post-Civil War South remains a cautionary tale about how even beloved studios can perpetuate harmful narratives. Unlike other controversial films that are available for scholarly study, Disney has never released Song of the South on home video in the United States, making it one of the most famous locked-away films in cinema history. Challenging the production code by the 1950s, filmmakers were increasingly challenging the strict production code that had governed Hollywood since the Scarface era. Otto Preminger emerged as one of censorship's most determined opponents, deliberately producing films that would force the system to change. His film The Moon is Blue deliberately broke taboos simply by using words like virgin, seduce, and pregnant in a light romantic comedy. Despite seeming incredibly tame to modern viewers, the film's straightforward discussion of sexuality was groundbreaking in 1953. The Production Code Administration denied the film its seal of approval, but Preminger and United Artists released it anyway, one of the first major challenges to the code's authority. The film was banned in several cities but became a box office success precisely because of the controversy. This demonstrated that audiences were ready for more mature content than censors gave them credit for, beginning a slow erosion of Hollywood's self-censorship. Preminger doubled down on controversial content 2 years later with The Man with the Golden Arm, which featured Frank Sinatra as a heroin addict struggling with withdrawal. The production code explicitly forbade depictions of drug addiction, but Preminger refused to soften the film's approach. Sinatra's harrowing portrayal of withdrawal symptoms brought the realities of addiction to mainstream audiences for the first time. Again, denied the production code seal, the film nevertheless was a critical and commercial success, winning Sinatra an Oscar nomination. The raw portrayal of addiction forced Hollywood to confront social issues it had previously ignored, continuing the gradual dismantling of censorship that would accelerate dramatically in the coming decades. Howard Hughes also challenged censors. With The Outlaw in 1943, a film notorious less for its content than for its marketing. Hughes obsessively highlighted Jane Russell's curves in promotional materials, defying the era's modest publicity standards. The film itself was delayed. For years, as Hughes battled censors, and the controversy helped make Russell a star. These confrontations with censorship authorities throughout the 1940s and 50s gradually weakened the production code's power, setting the stage for its eventual replacement with the more flexible MPAA rating system in 1968. The new Hollywood revolution, the late 1960s, marked a revolution in American cinema as a new generation of filmmakers shattered remaining taboos. Bonnie and Clyde reinvented the gangster film in 1967 with shocking violence and moral ambiguity. Its stylish portrayal of Depression-era bank robbers living fast and dying young divided critics but captivated audiences. The film's bloody finale, with its slow-motion ballet of bullet-riddled bodies, transformed how violence could be depicted on screen, not as simple morality but as tragic, visceral poetry. Director Arthur Penn drew inspiration from the French New Wave, bringing European art film sensibilities to American crime stories. The film glamorized its outlaw protagonists while showing the brutal consequences of their actions, a complexity that confounded older critics but resonated with younger audiences living through the Vietnam era. Prestigious critics like Bosley Crowther of the New York Times condemned the film's violence, while others like Pauline Kael recognized it as the beginning of a new American cinema. The film's success opened the floodgates for more graphic depictions of violence in mainstream films, from The Wild Bunch to The Godfather. That same year, Sidney Poitier starred in the Heat of the Night, which challenged racial prejudice with its story of a black detective forced to work with a racist sheriff in Mississippi. The film's unflinching portrayal of Southern racism and its famous scene where Poitier's character slaps a white man who had slapped him, an unprecedented moment in mainstream cinema, made it controversial in the South but helped advance civil rights conversations through popular culture. Just 2 years later, Midnight Cowboy became the first and only X-rated film to win the Academy Award for Best Picture. This gritty tale of a naive Texan hustler and a sickly conman surviving on New York City's unforgiving streets didn't flinch from showing the harsh realities of life on society's margins. Director John Schlesinger brought an outsider's eye to American urban decay, creating a film that felt both documentary-like and dreamlike in its portrayal of shattered American dreams. The film's unflinching portrayal of prostitution, homelessness, and sexual exploitation forced mainstream audiences to acknowledge urban struggles they'd preferred to ignore. The film's X rating, later changed to R without any cuts, didn't prevent it from achieving critical acclaim, proving that challenging content could also be recognized as high art. The success of Midnight Cowboy demonstrated how thoroughly audience tastes had changed by the end of the 1960s. As viewers increasingly demanded authentic and challenging stories that reflected the complexities of modern life. The early 1970s saw boundaries pushed even further as censorship continued to weaken. Sam Peckinpah's The Wild Bunch 1969 revolutionized screen violence with its balletic slow-motion bloodshed and moral ambiguity. Peckinpah used multiple cameras filming at different speeds to create unprecedented sequences where violence wasn't just shown but aestheticized, a technique that influenced countless directors from John Woo to Quentin Tarantino. The film's graphic gunfights shocked viewers accustomed to bloodless westerns where cowboys clutched their chests and fell over cleanly when shot. Stanley Kubrick's A Clockwork Orange, 1971, delivered a shocking vision of youth violence and psychological conditioning that divided audiences worldwide. The film's disturbing combination of ultraviolence with classical music created sequences so controversial that Kubrick himself withdrew the film from British distribution after receiving death threats and hearing reports that copycat crimes had been inspired by the movie. For decades, the film couldn't be legally seen in the UK, a rare case of a director censoring his own work. The film's clinical depiction of brutal assaults and its ambiguous moral stance, it asks viewers to sympathize with a sociopathic protagonist subjected to dehumanizing rehabilitation, continues to make it one of cinema's most ethically challenging works. Even more extreme was Ken Russell's The Devils, 1971, a film so religiously provocative with its scenes of sexually possessed nuns and corrupt church officials that it was banned in several countries and heavily cut in others. Based on historical events in 17th century France, the film depicts a priest accused of witchcraft after a hunchbacked nun has erotic visions about him, leading to mass hysteria in a convent. Russell's vivid visual style and the film's explicit combination of religious and sexual imagery made it particularly shocking to censors. Even today, the uncut version is rarely screened, making it one of cinema's most notorious lost films. Warner Brothers still refuses to release the complete director's cut, and various scenes, including the infamous Rape of Christ sequence where nuns desecrate a Jesus figure, exist only in poor-quality bootlegs. John Waters emerged as another. Provocateur with Pink Flamingos, 1972, a deliberately transgressive comedy starring drag queen Divine as the filthiest person alive. The film's infamous conclusion, where Divine actually eats dog feces on camera, ensured its place in the annals of shocking cinema. Waters' celebration of bad taste and underground culture made him a counterculture hero, though his films were too extreme for mainstream acceptance until much later in his career. The horror revolution. The horror genre became a particular battleground for censorship in the 1970s and 80s, as filmmakers used the genre to explore society's deepest taboos. Wes Craven's The Last House on the Left, 1972, brought unflinching brutality to American screens with its story of parents taking revenge on the criminals who assaulted and killed their daughter. The film's documentary-like style and unflinching depictions of violence led to it being banned in many countries and heavily cut in others. The film's tagline, "To avoid fainting, keep repeating, it's only a movie," acknowledged how devastating its impact could be on unprepared viewers. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, 1974, pushed boundaries further with its relentless intensity and documentary-like approach to horror. Despite having less graphic violence than many assumed, much of the brutality happens off-screen. Tobe Hooper's low-budget nightmare felt so real that it was banned in several countries, including the UK until 1999. The film's depiction of an innocent road trip turning into a fight for survival against a family of cannibals tapped into deep American anxieties about the rural-urban divide during a time of social upheaval. I Spit on Your Grave, 1978, became perhaps the most controversial of the rape revenge films that emerged in this era. The film's graphic depiction of a woman's assault, followed by her methodical revenge against her attackers, sparked intense debates about exploitation versus empowerment that continue to this day. Critic Roger Ebert famously called it a vile bag of garbage and walked out of the screening. Others have since reappraised it as a feminist work that uncompromisingly depicts male violence and female retribution. The film remains banned in some countries and heavily cut in others, with its unflinching approach to sexual violence making it perpetually controversial. Even more notorious was Cannibal Holocaust, 1980, which blurred the line between fiction and reality so effectively that its director Ruggero Deodato was actually arrested on suspicion of making a snuff film after rumors spread that his actors had been killed on camera. He had to produce his actors in court to prove they hadn't actually been murdered. The film pioneered the found footage technique decades before The Blair Witch Project, presenting itself as recovered documentary footage of a crew who met a grisly fate while filming cannibalistic tribes. While the human deaths were simulated, the film's real animal killings remain ethically troubling decades later, making it a permanent fixture in debates about artistic boundaries. The film was banned in over 50 countries, with some bans remaining in effect today. Despite its controversial status, film scholars recognize its technical innovations and its unflinching commentary on who the real savages are, the indigenous tribes or the exploitative Western filmmakers who provoke them. For sensationalist footage, the slasher boom of the early 1980s brought new challenges to censors. Films like Friday the 13th were criticized for linking sex and death, as characters who engaged in premarital sex were invariably killed soon after. In Britain, the video nasty panic led to dozens of horror films being banned from home video. Distribution including The Evil Dead, 1981, Sam Raimi's influential low-budget shocker about friends who accidentally unleash demons in a remote cabin. Despite the controversy, or perhaps because of it, The Evil Dead developed a dedicated fanbase and became a cornerstone for a long-running franchise. It proved that low-budget films could break new ground and leave a permanent mark on the genre. William Friedkin's The Exorcist, 1973, created unprecedented controversy despite being a major studio release. Reports of audience members fainting, vomiting, and having heart attacks circulated widely, adding to the film's mystique. Some religious groups condemned it as blasphemous, while others praised its ultimately faith-affirming message. The film's shocking scenes, including a young girl's head spinning completely around and her stabbing herself with a crucifix while shouting obscenities, broke taboos about children in danger and religious desecration. Despite the controversy, the film received 10 Academy Award nominations and is now considered one of the greatest horror films ever made. Henry, Portrait of a Serial Killer, 1986, took a different approach to horror with its documentary-like depiction of a serial killer's mundane life. Based loosely on real-life killer Henry Lee Lucas, the film adopts a flat, unembellished style that makes its violence all the more disturbing. There's no dramatic music, no cathartic ending, just a matter-of-fact presentation of a sociopath moving through the world. The film was given an X rating despite having less explicit gore than many R-rated slasher films, suggesting that its realistic approach to violence was considered more disturbing than fantastical horror. Director John McNaughton fought the rating, for years eventually releasing it unrated in 1990 to critical acclaim. Religious controversies, religious themes have consistently triggered some of cinema's most heated controversies. Martin Scorsese's The Last Temptation of Christ, 1988, became one of the most protested films in history despite its serious exploration of faith and doubt. Based on Nikos Kazantzakis' novel, the film imagines a human side of Jesus Christ, including his temptation to abandon his divine mission and live as an ordinary man. A dream sequence showing Jesus married to Mary Magdalene and having children particularly outraged religious groups who organized massive protests at theaters. The film's humanized portrayal of Jesus experiencing doubt and temptation led to theaters being firebombed in France, the film being banned in several countries, and death threats against Scorsese. Universal Studios received over 600,000 letters of protest before the film was even released. The controversy overshadowed the film's actual spiritual questioning, demonstrating how religious subject matter could still provoke violent reactions. In the modern era, many who condemned the film admitted they had never seen it, responding instead to out-of-context descriptions of its most controversial scenes. Monty Python's Life of Brian, 1979, took a different approach, using satire to poke fun not at Jesus himself, but at religious fanaticism and misplaced devotion. The film follows Brian, a man born next door to Jesus who is mistaken for the Messiah. Despite his protests, religious leaders condemned the film as blasphemous, and it was banned in several countries and regions for decades. Norway marketed it with the tagline, "So funny it was banned in Sweden," though Sweden had actually released it without issue. The Pythons defended their film by pointing out that it satirized blind faith and political extremism rather than Christian teachings. The controversy helped make it one of the comedy troupe's most successful films, and it's now considered a classic of religious satire. Kevin Smith's Dogma, 1999, also used comedy to explore religious themes, leading to 300,000 pieces of hate. Mail and several death threats to Smith even before the film was released. The Catholic League organized boycotts despite the film's ultimately faith-affirming message. Smith, himself a Catholic, argued that questioning faith is part of a healthy spiritual journey, a nuance lost in the heated controversy. End-of-century provocations. As the 1990s arrived, a new generation of filmmakers pushed boundaries in different ways. Oliver Stone's Natural-Born Killers, 1994, used frenetic editing and mixed media to create a disturbing vision of America's obsession with celebrity criminals. The film's hyperkinetic style, jumping between color, black and white, animation, and different film stocks, created a disorienting experience that mirrored the media oversaturation it criticized. The film became entangled in real-life controversies when several copycat murders were allegedly inspired by it, raising difficult questions about artistic responsibility. Stone argued that the film was clearly a satire of media violence rather than an endorsement of it, but the debate continues about whether depicting violence, even critically, can inadvertently glorify it. The controversy was so significant that Quentin Tarantino, who wrote the original script before Stone heavily modified it, distanced himself from the final film. Meanwhile, the low-budget independent film Kids, 1995, shocked audiences with its unflinching portrayal of urban teenagers engaged in risky sexual behavior and drug use during the height of the AIDS crisis. Directed by photographer Larry Clark and written by a 19-year-old Harmony Korine, the film's documentary-like approach gave it a disturbing authenticity that many viewers found hard to distinguish from exploitation. The film followed a day in the life of New York teens focused on casual sex, skateboarding, and drug use, with an HIV-positive protagonist unknowingly spreading the virus to multiple partners. Released with an NC-17 rating, Kids sparked debates about whether it was a cautionary tale or a voyeuristic look at youth in crisis. Its young cast, many of whom were not professional actors but actual teenagers from the skateboarding scene, added to concerns about the film's ethics. Nevertheless, it launched several careers and remains an influential document of 1990s youth culture and the indie film movement. David Cronenberg's Crash, 1996, explored even more taboo territory with its story of people who become sexually aroused by car accidents. Based on J.G. Ballard's novel, the film's clinical depiction of this paraphilia shocked even sophisticated festival audiences. At Cannes, jury president Francis Ford Coppola refused to present it with an award despite several jury members voting for it. In the UK, the Daily Mail led a campaign to ban the film, resulting in some local councils prohibiting its screening despite being passed by national censors. The controversy highlighted continuing tensions between artistic freedom and public sensibilities, even in the relatively permissive 1990s. The decade closed with Stanley Kubrick's final film, Eyes Wide Shut, 1999, which faced studio interference for its explicit orgy scene. Warner Brothers digitally altered the scene for its American release to secure an R rating, placing CGI figures to obscure explicit sexual activity. This digital censorship of a legendary director's final work sparked debates about studio power. And artistic integrity, especially after Kubrick's death before the film's release, meant he couldn't fight for his original vision. Extreme cinema in the new millennium. The new millennium brought fresh challenges to censorship with films that tested the boundaries of what audiences could endure. Gaspar Noé's Irreversible, 2002, featured a 9-minute unbroken take of sexual assault and another scene of a man's head being crushed with a fire extinguisher. The film's reverse chronological structure forces viewers to witness these brutal acts before understanding their context. Many viewers walked out of festival screenings unable to endure the film's unflinching depiction of violence. Noé deliberately used low-frequency sound in early scenes to induce physical discomfort in the audience, creating a visceral experience of trauma. Lars von Trier became cinema's newest provocateur with films like Dancer in the Dark, 2000, Dogville, 2003, and Antichrist, 2009, which featured increasingly explicit depictions of violence and sexuality. Antichrist particularly shocked audiences with its graphic scenes of genital mutilation and its bleak vision of human nature. At its Cannes premiere, audience members fainted, vomited, and shouted at the screen. The film's unrelenting brutality and psychological horror made it one of the most controversial art films of the century so far. Pascal Logier's Martyrs, 2008, pushed the boundaries of the French extreme horror movement with its philosophical approach to torture. The film follows a woman seeking revenge for childhood abuse who discovers a secret society conducting experiments to glimpse the afterlife through the suffering of martyrs. Despite its extreme violence, the film has been praised for its serious, philosophical underpinnings and refusal to sensationalize its difficult subject matter. It represents a new wave of transgressive cinema that uses genre conventions to explore profound questions about suffering and transcendence. The legacy of controversial cinema throughout cinema history, these controversial films have served as cultural fault lines, revealing society's deepest fears and anxieties. While some have been embraced as misunderstood masterpieces, others remain troubling examples of art that tests the boundaries of what we're willing to see and confront. Their legacy lives on in every film that dares to challenge conventions and push viewers outside their comfort zones. The most provocative films are rarely just about shock value. They force us to question our assumptions about morality, politics, religion, and even the purpose of art itself. From technical innovations wrapped in problematic messaging to low-budget provocations that changed film language forever, these controversial works remind us that cinema at its most powerful doesn't just entertain, it disturbs, challenges, and sometimes even transforms us. The story of controversial cinema is also the story of evolving social attitudes. Films once considered beyond the pale, like Midnight Cowboy or A Clockwork Orange, now appear regularly on greatest films lists and are studied in university courses. Yet each generation finds new boundaries to push and new taboos to challenge, ensuring that cinema remains a battleground for cultural values and artistic freedom. The line between groundbreaking and exploitation continues to shift with each generation. But one thing remains constant. The films that society has tried hardest to silence often end up speaking the loudest across time. They become cultural touchstones precisely because they refuse to look away from uncomfortable truths, even when audiences and authorities demand they do so. In this way, cinema's most controversial works don't just tell us about film history. They reveal who we were, who we are, and perhaps most importantly, what we're still afraid to see. As we look to cinema's future, new technologies and platforms will undoubtedly create fresh controversies. Virtual reality, AI-generated content, and increasingly realistic special effects will blur the lines between representation and reality in ways that today's filmmakers can barely imagine. But the fundamental questions raised by controversial cinema will remain. What are the responsibilities of artists to their audiences? What is the purpose of depicting disturbing or taboo subject matter? And how do we balance freedom of expression with protection from harm? The films that have shocked us throughout history offer no easy answers to these questions. Instead, they remind us that art at its most powerful is rarely comfortable, and that the movies that disturb us the most may also be the ones that help us confront difficult truths about ourselves and our world.